Isobel, Phyllis and Paulette McDonagh were sisters, best friends and business partners. They were daring, young and eccentric, and they wanted to make movies. Making a film in Australia would not be easy, but together they could do anything. It was the start of the adventure of their lives.
I'd read about them here and there, and I'd been intrigued. I was thinking, the McDonagh sisters, there was no other qualifying information to say who they were or what they were. The fact that there were three sisters involved in making films intrigued me.
Isobel, the eldest and a mother hen, was the actress and star of all their films under the name Marie Lorraine. Phyllis, the practical all-rounder, took on the work of art director, publicist and producer, while Paulette, who had a flair for the dramatic, became their director and writer. And though the youngest of the three, she was the boss on the film set.
The McDonagh sisters were trailblazers. They created a chemistry with the audience, which was very rare for Australian filmmakers at that time.
There were women flying planes and women doing, smoking cigarettes and doing jazz dancing. Filmmaking was another thing that women were attempting to do.
I used to start in the morning and I'd sit there and love the film. And I'd go back to the afternoon session. I'd watch how the actors moved, the backgrounds, how they put the film together. I took the whole thing in and I'd watch and watch it. And it made an impression on my mind. When it came to the close-up, I saw what they did and what it meant to portray it, and then moved to a mid-shot and a long shot, and learned how to do films that way.
Drummoyne House was the family home, with its grand rooms filled with their father's antique furniture. It was the perfect movie set and an ideal playground for the 7 McDonagh children.
It was a wonderful place for the younger children to live and to grow up in. If you see the films, you'll see much of the settings was in Drummoyne House. They always had theatrical people there, so they grew up in that air of people in the entertainment business. They'd dress up and it was all just such fun.
It was in our blood, you see. We were brought up into it. We used to run a salon, and every great artist that ever visited from overseas would come to our home.
The McDonaghs could be hard critics of each other's work, but they were close, so close they were a world to themselves. And the centre of their world was always their next film.
The scriptwriting sessions involving Paulette, Phyllis and Isobel were like free fights.
We're going to have to rewrite the whole thing.
They'd often start early in the evening and they'd go on all night. And neighbours who could hear these really vigorous discussions, even arguments, thought that there were massive domestics going on in the McDonagh family. But this is the way they worked. This is the way they thrashed ideas out.
This is pathetic! I don't believe this story! Neither do I. Well, you can just write it yourself then.
The McDonagh sisters are significant for me, not just as a woman, but as a person working in the Australian context. If you don't have examples of people who have come before you, if you think that people like you can't make films, then it's very difficult to convince other people and yourself that you can do it. And to have looked back in history and discovered that Australians did make films and that even a few women made films somehow is a sort of ammunition or support to the efforts to do so later.
They weren't feminists in any sense, but they had a sense of themselves and they didn't recognise that there was a division in what people could do if they were male or female. They just wanted to do it and they did it.
Sydney. And in the 1920s, the new beats of jazz spill out from the bars and the dance halls into the streets, while the iron and steel of the Harbour Bridge is taking shape. Now there was a new woman. They cut their hair, they shortened their skirts, and they wanted a new freedom. And in 1926, the McDonagh sisters set out to make their first feature film, Those Who Love.
Some confusion whether other money had come from the father's estate or whether it came through to the father through Uncle Ernest. But it just gave them that chance to really start making film.
Paulette wasn't exactly confident of her ability to get the best out of actors, so she actually went to an acting school run by PJ Ramster in Sydney. According to both Phyllis and Isobel, Ramster was a bit of a shyster, but Paulette was charmed by him. So Ramster actually began work on Those Who Love as technical director, very closely watched by Paulette.
At that stage, I was green and trying to find out about how to make films. Well, I thought, now I've got to have somebody to tell me what to do with my stars. So I engaged him.
For this scene, Isobel,
He got there and he was there with my script. I was standing by the side, and everything he told them, he was doing the opposite to everything I'd written.
What emotion?
Oh, forget the script, it's a nonsense.
Excuse me, Mr. Ramster.
What a nong that man was.
We'll be requiring your services.
Eventually, I told him to get out. I was learning nothing. I was actually teaching him.
They couldn't have a sort of second-rate bloke be a director just because he was a bloke. So, yeah, that was a bit of a lesson. Then they realised they needed to depend upon their own talents.
I don't want anything too overdone.
Well, we could have some directional lighting coming from the left.
Thank you. Action.
Elaine de Chair was the daughter of the Governor of New South Wales and had a bit role in Those Who Love. It was fairly logical that Elaine de Chair be invited to the premiere of Those Who Love, and so her father was also invited. And because her father was also invited, the creme de la creme of New South Wales, or at least Sydney society, also attended the premiere of Those Who Love.
The film has received the best public reaction of any picture I can recollect in the last 15 years.
The result is a dazzling triumph which is said to be the best Australian film that has yet graced the screen.
A Sydney girl whose histrionic ability is remarkable. Her splendid performance ranks with some of the best characterisations ever given to the screen by the world's greatest stars.
Paulette and Isobel were sitting there watching the film, and the orchestra was playing a very sentimental piece at one point. And Paulette looked around and noticed Dudley de Chair holding a handkerchief up to his eyes and nudged each other. And Paulette recalled that later on, quite a number of men, for some reason, only men, she mentioned only men, in the audience were crying. Phyllis McDonagh, being a wonderful publicist right to her life, I'm sure fed the press the line, "Governor cries at film." Now, whether he was copiously weeping or not, I don't know. But he was certainly seen to be crying.
Those Who Love was a box office hit. It was publicised to the hilt and did very well all around Australia, earning more money than the successful Charlie Chaplin film of that year, The Gold Rush.
When we made films, everything we earned we used to put on these huge parties at Drummoyne House. 150 people, all in full evening dress. Great parties. Oh, God almighty. And they'd go on all night till dawn the next day. Never end.
None of their films are about the Australian bush, which is one of the interesting things about them. And I know that the debate about, to be an Australian film, the film had to be redolent with the scent of gum leaves, which was a quote that was used for another silent film. And the McDonagh sisters didn't do that. And so this, to me, I thought it was very brave that they actually didn't just go automatically to a specifically Australian story. They actually used what is the more universal story of, love, betrayal, redemption, those kinds of things that constitute those sort of human dramas. They chose to, I think wisely, make their films closer to themselves and their own experiences.
The influences in McDonagh films are very clearly those of Hollywood, but also very clearly those of German expressionism. German films were making an impact in world cinema in the 1920s. The sense of mystery, the sense of duplicity, the wonderful sets of wall safes that appear from behind picture frames, or a flight of steps that emerge out of the wall to become, to lead up to a wall safe, are straight out of a Fritz Lang Dr. Mabuse film.
I think ultimately they didn't make them for an Australian film industry. I think ultimately they made them for themselves.
With the success of Those Who Love, the sisters could now start on their second film, The Far Paradise.
The Far Paradise has a smoothness and finish rare in Australian films. The astute sisters have realised that America has developed the techniques of production to a fine art and have been willing to learn.
Nice work, effective work, darn difficult work to maintain a natural dramatic balance that struck in splendid contrast to the wide-eyed hysteric or simpers that pass for drama and romance with most of our local film heroines.
The Far Paradise was as big a hit as Those Who Love, but their distribution deal meant the money didn't go to the McDonaghs. The sisters ended the year poorer than when they had begun.
The McDonaghs liked, I think, as part of their image, as part of the image of their filmmaking and the publicity for their films, to maintain this illusion of wealth. They were certainly socially very well connected. They knew the shakers and the movers. They knew people that their parents had known and the children of the people that their parents had known. And so they were able to network very effectively.
By the late 1920s, finances were biting all the more strongly. The sisters had inherited money from their father and an uncle, but they devoted all of it to making their films. They had mortgaged Drummoyne House several times over, but there was simply not enough for the family to live on.
The reality was that by the late 1920s, the McDonaghs were often starving. They often didn't have enough money to put food on the table for 7 members of the family. With the death of Annie McDonagh, their mother, in the mid-1920s, Isobel was now the leader of the family. To be making films amid those circumstances was very much a dedicated, very highly dedicated activity.
The long arm of Hollywood had reached Australia. America was sending in its big movies, big money, and big stars.
Oh, it was an absolute bombardment. It was a huge onrush. It was like a tsunami.
They owned the production studios, they owned the distribution, and in many cases they controlled the exhibition, even in a place like Australia. And they controlled the exhibition through all sorts of methods. Now, this is just natural that large corporations will act in their own self-interest. But what happened was that the Australian filmmakers who didn't have a studio, except for Australasian films, couldn't possibly stand up to this. No way could they stand up to it. Just as now, the films came with all the stars and the advertising, and the whole machinery of it.
The Australian film industry was fragile. A Royal Commission was established in 1927 to look at how the government could protect the industry and keep Australian filmmaking alive.
What was really important about what people were trying to do at the Royal Commission was to get some sort of government backing for things such as, film censorship boards, quotas for Australian film. They were essentially trying to protect the industry. It's about not just the creativity and the craft that's gone into making the films, but it's about the expressions that come out of a national identity. I think Isobel was quite sensible in a lot of what she said at the Royal Commission. She talked about Australian films were very viable, and at one point she was actually asked if she thought that Australians were patriotic enough to go to their own films, and she said she thought they were. And I hope they still are.
The sisters were called to a meeting with Frank Thring Sr., managing director of one of the biggest cinema chains, Hoyt's Theatres. Delighted with the script for their next film, The Cheaters, he made them an amazing offer, a complete distribution and exhibition deal, promising it would put them on golden thrones in Hollywood. But the deal gave the sisters no money to live on now. Boldly they asked him for a wage, but it was too big a risk, and Thring refused. The deal was off.
I think the McDonaghs all looked at him fairly incredulously and said, "Thanks, but no thanks, Mr. Thring," and they turned on their heels and they left. Paulette later regarded their rejection of Frank Thring's offer as a big mistake.
Money was now so tight the family was forced to sell Drummoyne House and move. And yet the sisters still found money for a film. They persuaded a family friend, Neville Macken, to invest in their next picture. The McDonagh sisters were back in production, this time on The Cheaters.
The McDonaghs decided to enter The Cheaters into the Best Australian Film Production competition. The problem there was that that competition actually required a sound film.
As this transition was happening from silent to sound, a lot of the live musicians were finding that their work was being cut, certainly cut way back, because more and more talkies were beginning to appear. The McDonagh sisters ran into one of those problems when they were trying to record soundtracks for The Cheaters to turn it into a talkie. There was an enormous amount of employment for musicians night after night playing for silent films. With the coming of sound, that was a whole group of people who were effectively out of a job. They had a screening of a partial, of a version of the film as they were progressing from a full silent to a talkie, which was apparently an absolute disaster.
I was placed in charge of running the discs from the projection booth, and in order to maintain a constant level, Phyllis was seated in the audience with a buzzer on the arm of her chair. If the sound was too soft, she'd buzz once, and I'd turn the volume up. If it was too loud, then I'd receive 2 buzzes. At the height of the True Heart confession, Phyllis buzzed twice for the sound to be decreased, and I, misunderstanding her, upped the volume. There was a roar of laughter from no less than 1,700 people, and there was no keeping them quiet after that.
The Cheaters, as a silent film, I think had a life of its own and was an entity on its own, and I think is a very good film. By the time they get into its talkie version, it's really very boring.
I loved him terribly. That is why I left. I could not bear him to know I was unworthy. A cheap, rotten little thief.
To me, it was a damn good film ruined. Yeah, when they tried to turn it into a talkie.
We have no claim on happiness.
The Commonwealth Film Contest, by all accounts, seems to have been a bit of a farce. The fact that The Cheaters came fourth in the contest was no comfort to the McDonaghs whatsoever. Paulette McDonagh was absolutely passionate about a play called 2 Minutes Silence, which she saw in a small theatre in Sydney in 1930. 2 Minutes Silence was not the kind of comfortable melodrama they'd been making, was not the kind of naturalistic, romantic film they'd been making. It was an anti-war play. Paulette felt that this would appeal to an audience who was still feeling the aftershocks of World War I. She felt that it would strike a very definite chord with audiences.
2 Minutes Silence failed at the box office. The money had gone, and their spirit went with it. Paulette later said of that time, "I gave up. I didn't want to try anymore, I suppose." The McDonagh sisters would never make a film together again.
There were people in Paulette's life, there were relatives and friends who were actually quite angry that 2 Minutes Silence was the last film that she made. That this woman who was clearly highly talented, energetic, was wonderfully creative, made no more films after the early 1930s. I think it's a tragic waste.
When Gillian Armstrong directed My Brilliant Career in 1979, she was the first Australian woman credited with directing a mainstream feature film since Paulette McDonagh directed 2 Minutes Silence in the early 1930s.
Very little of the work of the McDonagh sisters survives. We can only see parts of some films and, most of the cheetahs. It's wonderful to see what people made films about, how they made the films, what was in their minds. And you have to have the films to do it. It's not regarded as a precious resource, and it is a precious resource.
Isobel married and moved to London, where she had 3 children and acted occasionally on the stage. Phyllis also married and worked in New Zealand as a journalist until returning to Australia as the social editor of the North Shore Times. She became a prolific writer of short stories. Paulette, their writer and director, who never married, for a short time made documentaries. She lived out the rest of her days in King's Cross until her death in 1978. The sisters discovered that a great adventure begun needed even more daring and luck to keep going, more than they could win in their time. But together they were the first women in Australia to form their own film company, and Paulette was the first woman credited in her own right as a director and writer of an Australian feature film. And for the rest of their lives, these 3 remarkable sisters were also best friends.
Unless you've got something very worthwhile. Life is so short. You've got to live it only for today, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, do you? Live it as much as you can.